Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now let's begin with Story 1, The Scribe and the Scholar, Egyptian Wisdom in Monastic Libraries. In the long halls of a 10th century monastery, nestled deep in the quiet folds of a Frankish valley or perched on the sun-bleached edges of the Sinai Peninsula, there existed a rhythm, a pattern of steps worn into stone by sandaled feet, the quiet rustle of parchment, the tick of a reed pen being cut with care. Silence, heavy and respected, was not empty, it was a medium for divine thought. And in the heart of this silence often were books. But not just any books. Some bore strange symbols, curved shapes like owls, arms, reeds, and thrones. Some monks looked upon them with suspicion, others with awe. These were echoes from an older world, papyrus scrolls and fragments from Egypt, copied and recopied, eventually to rest between the covers of Christian codices. How did they get there? It's a path not often walked by modern minds, but it begins in an Egyptian scriptorium, centuries before, where temple scribes carved their knowledge not only into tomb walls, but also onto fragile scrolls that would find their way slowly to the shelves of early Christian libraries. The afterlife of Egyptian texts. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell, many of the great temples of Egypt, Luxor, Karnak, Edfu, had become quiet. Their priests, once keepers of cosmic order through ritual and text, were gone or converted, their libraries looted or decayed. And yet something remained. The early Christians of Egypt, particularly the Copts, were not strangers to books. Coptic script itself was a hybrid Greek letters adapted to the sounds of the Egyptian tongue, created in part to transcribe the teachings of both Christ and the pharaohs. Some texts, once sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom, were reinterpreted. His image faded, but his knowledge persisted in the scribal traditions that followed. Monks learned to copy, and in copying they preserved. Egyptian wisdom texts such as the Instructions of Ptahhotep or the Maxims of Ani emphasized humility, moderation, and respect for divine order. These themes fit comfortably within Christian moral philosophy. And so they were not destroyed, they were rewritten, transformed, transmitted. Cultural drift across centuries. In an isolated Benedictine monastery in 9th century Gaul, a monk may not have known he was reading a work of Egyptian origin, but when he copied out the Latin translation of the sayings of the wise men, or on the duties of the heart, he was, in some distant way, repeating the voice of an Egyptian sage. These texts traveled not by grand caravans, but by quiet scholarly migration, manuscript to manuscript, scriptorium to scriptorium. Some came through Greek intermediaries. Alexandrian scholars like Clement and Origen had already baptized Hellenistic and Egyptian ideas into early Christian doctrine. Others were translated more directly, especially through the preservation efforts of Coptic and Syriac communities in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Mesopotamia. In the East, monasteries along the Nile retained fragments of Hermetic thought, practical medicine, and agricultural lore, often mistakenly interpreted as purely local Christian teachings. In the West, the lingering memory of Egypt became a symbol of both danger and depth, the land of pharaohs and plagues, but also of wisdom and ancient glory. What survived most endearingly, however, was a reverence for the book as sacred vessel. Ancient Egypt had long held the written word as divine. To write was to call things into being. Monastic life in the Middle Ages, particularly in Egypt, embraced this view wholly. Writing was prayer. Reading was worship. Every book was copied with care, not merely to preserve information, but to honor it. Manuscripts copied in Egyptian monasteries, especially those at Wadi el-Natron, and the White Monastery near Sohag, spread through Coptic networks into Nubia, Palestine, and beyond. These monastic centers saw Egyptian scribes transcribe both sacred Christian texts and older medical or philosophical treatises that carried remnants of Egyptian cosmology. By the 10th century, parts of these texts had already reached Arabic-speaking Muslim scholars, Latin-speaking monks in Spain, and the libraries of the Vatican itself. But what did these scribes think of their task? They rarely wrote about themselves. Yet marginalia, those little scribbled notes in the corners of pages, reveal glimpses, complaints about cold fingers, prayers for strength, statements of awe at the texts they copied. One such note from a 9th century Egyptian monk reads, "Though I do not understand all that is written here, it is old, and so I keep it." This reverence for age, for preservation above comprehension, was itself a kind of worship. It ensured that the wisdom of one age, no matter how obscure, could find new life in another. When Egypt became symbolic, to many medieval minds, Egypt became less a real place and more a metaphor. It was the place the Israelites fled, the land of pyramids and mystery, the site of Joseph's dreams. But it was also, paradoxically, the cradle of Christian asceticism and intellectual rigor. The Desert Fathers, monks like Anthony the Great, hailed from Egypt and inspired generations of Western monastics. And so, when medieval scholars encountered cryptic moral teachings from unknown origins or found parallels between Egyptian and Christian ethical instruction, it did not feel foreign. It felt ancient, sanctified by time. In this way, Egyptian wisdom became cloaked in Christian language, its bones dressed in new skin. But were these borrowings conscious acts of preservation, or accidents of historical drift? Did the scribes know they were preserving a world older than Abraham? Or did they, perhaps, simply feel the weight of something important, something venerable, without knowing precisely why? In the early centuries of the Christian era, amidst the decline of pharaonic power and the rise of Byzantine and Roman influence in Egypt, a quiet revolution took place, not on the battlefield or in court, but in the scriptoria of monasteries and the minds of translators. This revolution did not wield swords or build pyramids. It reshaped the nature of knowledge transmission, preserving layers of ancient Egyptian wisdom beneath the surface of Christian theology and philosophy. The heart of this transformation was a linguistic and cultural bridge known as Coptic Egypt, a civilization that neither fully left behind the gods of its past nor surrendered entirely to the creeds of empire. At the heart of this transition was not a general or a pharaoh, but a scribe. Coptic as a conduit of thought. The Coptic language, which emerged around the 2nd century CE, was more than a dialect. It was a deliberate preservation effort. Using the Greek alphabet with additional characters to represent sounds unique to Egyptian, it allowed scribes to transcribe both older hieratic writings and the Christian Gospels with a level of linguistic fidelity not previously possible. This script was the key that unlocked the continued relevance of Egyptian ideas. More importantly, it made them portable. For the first time, Egyptian wisdom could travel in a form legible to Greek, Latin, and even early Arabic scholars. Texts like the Pistis Sophia, a mystical Christian Gnostic gospel, show an intricate blending of Coptic Christian theology with imagery and cosmology that echo ancient Egyptian thought. Souls navigating realms, hierarchies of divine beings, and a preoccupation with the soul's purification and ascent. These weren't new ideas, but old ones repackaged, reinterpreted, and kept alive. The rise of the Coptic monasteries. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Egypt had become the beating heart of Christian monasticism. Desert Fathers such as Anthony the Great, Pachomius, and Shenout of Atripe retreated into the vast silences of the eastern and western deserts to seek communion with God. But their isolation did not lead to oblivion. Rather, these monastics built networks both physical and intellectual that would shape religious thought for centuries. The White Monastery of Shenout, located near Sohag in Upper Egypt, became one of the most influential literary and spiritual centers of late antiquity. Shenout himself, a prolific writer in Coptic, composed homilies, letters, and theological reflections that reveal not only his Christian convictions, but also his debt to Egyptian ethical traditions. Concepts of Ma'at truth, justice, cosmic balance were not cited by name, but lived in the rhythm and rigor of monastic life. Monks were expected to live orderly lives, respect hierarchy, confess faults, and maintain the purity of the community values reminiscent of Egyptian temple discipline. The monastic libraries at places like Wadi el Natron and Kelia housed collections that spanned biblical texts, commentaries, apocrypha, and secular wisdom writings. Here, papyrus scrolls coexisted with codices. The former carried whispers of the old gods, the latter bore the words of the apostles. Both were copied with the same meticulous reverence. The Codex and the transformation of memory. One of the great technological shifts of this era was the move from scroll to codex, a bound book with pages that could be flipped and referenced. This format, favored by Christian scribes, enabled easier study, cross-referencing, and portability. It allowed knowledge to be rearranged, compared, annotated, and crucially preserved. In monasteries across Egypt, older scrolls, some with Egyptian, Greek, or Jewish origins, were copied into codices. This process often involved translation, sometimes multiple times, from Demotic to Greek to Coptic to Arabic or Latin. During these transitions, meaning sometimes shifted. A parable about divine balance in an Egyptian funerary text might become a Christian homily on judgment and grace. A practical treatise on farming cycles along the Nile might be preserved in a theological context, as proof of divine order in nature. And yet, despite these reinterpretations, something of the original always remained. A concept of the eternal soul, a reverence for the Word, an insistence on the moral order of the universe. These were ideas too large to be destroyed by translation. The Islamic link, Coptic and Arabic preservation. By the 7th century, Egypt had come under Islamic rule. The Arab administration brought with it a curiosity for knowledge, particularly in the fields of medicine, astronomy, alchemy, and theology. Many Coptic scribes found themselves not pushed out, but incorporated into this new world of translation and scholarship. Coptic became a stepping stone to Arabic for many Egyptian texts. Under Abbasid patronage, translation houses in Baghdad would seek knowledge wherever it could be found, including Egypt's monastic libraries. Coptic Christians, often bilingual in Greek and Egyptian, served as vital translators of classical knowledge into Arabic. Alongside Syriac and Nestorian scholars, they preserved fragments of Hermetic texts, philosophical dialogues, and cosmological treatises that would later influence Islamic mystics and scientists. In particular, texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary figure often linked to the Egyptian god Thoth, saw new life in Arabic. His writings, though heavily Hellenized, carried Egyptian philosophical DNA, ideas about the unity of the cosmos, the hidden knowledge of the stars, and the possibility of spiritual ascent. These ideas entered medieval Islam not as foreign imports, but as rediscovered truths filtered through Coptic scribes who viewed their role as preservers of God's wisdom in all its forms. Latin monasticism and the Egyptian book. Even in Western Europe, where physical Egyptian texts were rare, the idea of Egyptian knowledge permeated. Medieval Latin scholars, particularly within Benedictine and later Cluniac monasteries, revered Egypt as a land of ancient mystery. In the margins of their manuscripts, they scribbled notes about Chaldean wisdom, or Egyptian science. Alchemical texts, often falsely attributed to ancient Egyptian figures, were passed around like sacred relics. One of the most famous examples is the Tabula Smaragdina, the Emerald Tablet, a brief cryptic text attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Though short, it was believed to contain the secrets of alchemical transformation and divine unity. The tablet was copied and discussed in dozens of monasteries, its Egyptian origins treated with reverence even when largely misunderstood. The text begins, "That which is above is like that which is below." This mirrored the ancient Egyptian principle of duality, the balance between Upper and Lower Egypt, between life and death, between divine and earthly realms. Such echoes rang softly through medieval theological reflection, sometimes unnoticed, sometimes glorified. In monastic circles, especially among mystics like Hildegard of Bingen or Richard of St. Victor, Egypt became not just a land but a symbol of hidden wisdom buried like Joseph, yet able to nourish the world during famine. Personal stories, hidden labors. Of course, most of the scribes who facilitated this transmission remain nameless. We know them through their mistakes, a misspelled word, a skipped line, or their fatigue, as recorded in marginalia. "I am weary, it is dark, may God reward the one who reads this." I copied this from the old scroll. The letters were strange, may it still be useful. These comments, scattered across Egyptian, Greek, and Latin manuscripts, are the only personal traces of thousands of years of intellectual labor. They reveal not philosophers, but laborers, people who saw knowledge as something worthy of long hours, careful copying and preservation beyond understanding. One wonders, did they feel a burden in preserving the past? Did they sense the weight of Egypt's millennia pressing through their reed pens? Or were they simply trying to do what so many before them had done, keep the flame alive, even if they didn't know who would see it? Unresolved thought. How much of our current understanding of religion, philosophy, and ethics was shaped not by theologians or emperors, but by anonymous scribes in Egyptian deserts copying words they only partly understood, in languages that were already beginning to fade? The long story of Egyptian wisdom, how it flowed silently from the temples of Thoth to the scribal benches of Christian monks, was never marked by grand declarations. There was no parade when Egyptian ethics found a home in monastic rules, no chronicler who paused to remark when a saying of Ptahhotep resurfaced in a Latin sermon. The transition was so slow, so organic, and so obscured by layers of translation, that its success was precisely in how forgettable it became. And yet, even in its fatting, the influence of Egypt endured, not in headlines or in the fame of emperors, but in the fine grooves of vellum, the meticulous quill strokes of scribes, and the enduring moral vocabulary of medieval Christianity and Islam alike. Now we conclude this first story with the long tale of legacy, where things were lost, what remained, and how, even now, the echoes of the Nile still murmur through the stacks of forgotten libraries. The hidden afterlife of texts. By the time the 13th century dawned, many of the original Egyptian papyri had crumbled into dust, their fibers too fragile to survive the centuries. What remained were copies: Greek, Coptic, Syriac, Latin, Arabic, preserved in codices scattered from Ethiopia to Iberia, often misattributed, often anonymous. In many cases, the content no longer even bore Egyptian names. The maxims of ancient Egyptian sages were now associated with biblical figures, saints, or even fictional wise men created by medieval scribes to give authority to old teachings. For instance, themes like, "Do not speak while another speaks. It is the mark of wisdom to listen. The heart that honors order will prosper, while the mouth that loves contention will perish," appear almost verbatim in early Christian monastic rulebooks, some derived from Eastern desert traditions, others from anonymous collections in Latin Europe. These thoughts, in spirit if not form, are direct continuations of Egyptian wisdom texts like the instructions of Amenemop or the teaching of Ani. But attribution faded, and in that fading something else happened. The wisdom stopped being Egyptian, it became universal. Monastic libraries, the custodians of memory. Medieval monastic libraries were strange places, equal parts sanctuary, prison, and graveyard. Books were chained to desks not only to prevent theft, but to acknowledge their preciousness. Some codices were read regularly, others, once copied, were stored and never opened again. In dusty corners of monasteries from Sinai to Mont Saint Michel, texts of Egyptian origin sat dormant. They bore no grand titles. Sometimes they lacked even authorship, but they lived on. The Rule of St. Benedict, the foundational text of Western monasticism, likely absorbed indirect influences from the monastic rules and ethical codes developed in Egyptian Cenobitic communities centuries earlier. The emphasis on humility, obedience, silence, and self-restraint, these were not uniquely Benedictine virtues. They were Egyptian values reborn in Christian clothing. And then there was the care for order, that cosmic balance the Egyptians called Ma'at. In a monastery, everything had its time: prayer, labor, eating, reading. Disrupting the order wasn't just inconvenient, it was spiritually dangerous. Disorder was sin. This was not Roman efficiency or Greek logic. It was, in its bones, the same principle carved into tomb walls in the time of Ramses. So, even when the language changed, the rhythm of the Nile survived in the daily bells of medieval monks. Losses in translation. But we must also consider what was lost. So many texts, scientific, spiritual, artistic, were never translated. Political shifts, religious prejudice, and the fragility of papyrus meant that enormous swaths of Egyptian literature simply vanished. Some were burned during religious purges, others decayed for lack of interest. The Library of Alexandria, whose destruction still lingers in the Western imagination, was not the only tragedy. Smaller libraries, temple collections, private libraries of scribes, monastic holdings were lost to history not in fires but in forgetting. Some knowledge was absorbed into dominant cultures. Other parts were overwritten, dismissed as pagan, or misread entirely. Many of the alchemical texts attributed to Egyptian origins in the Latin Middle Ages were reconstructions, idealized visions of a wise Egypt that may have never existed in quite the way imagined. And yet, even these imaginative appropriations point to a truth, that medieval minds felt a profound respect for Egypt, even if they understood it poorly. To believe that Egypt held secrets, whether about metals, the stars, or the soul, was itself a form of legacy. One does not build myths about something one considers irrelevant. The scholar's quiet pilgrimage. In the 14th century, a Franciscan friar in England noted a strange proverb in a manuscript from Toledo. It spoke of the eternal heart weighed against a feather and referenced an unnamed judgment. The friar, puzzled, assumed it to be a poetic metaphor from a local mystic. What he didn't know was that he was paraphrasing the weighing of the heart, a central tenet of Egyptian funerary belief from 2,000 years prior. He copied the passage dutifully into his notebook and added a marginal comment. The ancients, it seems, did not lack for insight. He wasn't wrong, but he also didn't know how ancient the thought truly was. This kind of scholar, the patient copier, the curious theologian, the cautious translator, was the true vessel through which Egyptian wisdom flowed into medieval religious thought. Their work was slow, unrecognized, and often unaware of its own depth. Yet their fingerprints are everywhere, not in famous treatises, but in aphorisms, proverbs, prayers, and rules of life. Modern glimpses, reclaiming the past. Today, scholars using papyrological and manuscript tools are rediscovering some of these lost links. Textual comparisons reveal phrases and structures that match ancient Egyptian literature. Coptic texts, once dismissed as minor, are now seen as critical bridges between antiquity and the medieval world. Libraries like those of Nag Hammadi, discovered in the 20th century, offer tantalizing glimpses into what once was. Christian Gnostic texts written in Coptic, infused with Egyptian cosmology, hiding in plain sight. And yet, for all our modern clarity, it remains nearly impossible to untangle the full extent of Egypt's impact. The lines blur, influence becomes absorption, borrowing becomes transformation. But perhaps that's the point. Egypt's legacy in medieval religious thought wasn't a matter of conquest or control. It was a drift, a slow settling of silt on the floor of an intellectual river. And like the Nile, whose waters shaped every aspect of the land it touched, Egypt's ideas shaped the minds of monks, mystics, and scribes who never once saw the pyramids. Final reflection: what we carry without knowing. The story of Egyptian wisdom in medieval religious life is not a tale of loud revolutions or visible victories. It is, instead, a story of resilience of ideas carried across centuries not by power, but by persistence. A scribe copies a text he cannot fully understand because it is old and therefore sacred. A monk writes a rule of silence, unaware that he echoes the philosophy of a civilization long gone. A translator in Baghdad renders Hermetic principles into Arabic, seeing them not as pagan, but as universal. And even today, when we speak of justice, order, humility, and the weighing of hearts not in myth, but in metaphor, we are, in some distant way, whispering Egypt's name. It is not the loud legacies that last the longest. It is the ones written in quiet hands, on fragile pages, by those who believed that wisdom, no matter its source, was worth preserving. Story 2: Hermes Trismegistus and the Coptic Veil. Before the name Hermes Trismegistus ever echoed through the vaulted halls of medieval alchemical laboratories, before it was invoked by mystics in Florence or scribbled in Latin in the margins of dusty manuscripts, it was whispered along the banks of the Nile. It emerged not as a name, but as a conflation, a fusion between Thoth, the ibis-headed Egyptian god of writing and wisdom, and the Greek god Hermes, the fleet-footed messenger and psychopomp. In this section, we journey to that liminal zone in time and culture where gods overlapped and myth became philosophy. It is here, in the syncretic melting pot of Greco-Roman Egypt, that a strange figure was born. Hermes the thrice great, not a deity, not quite a prophet, but something else entirely. The birth of a composite. The city of Hermopolis Magna, originally Kemenyu, located in Middle Egypt, had long been sacred to Thoth. To the ancient Egyptians, Thoth was the divine scribe who maintained the cosmic order, Mot, inventor of writing and judge of the dead. He was impartial, measured, and eternal. The Greeks, arriving centuries later, saw in Thoth a parallel to their Hermes, not the trickster of Homer, but the Hermes of the philosophers, a guide of souls, an emissary of divine knowledge. As Hellenistic rule took hold under the Ptolemies in the 3rd century BCE, religious syncretism flourished. Thoth and Hermes merged not merely in theology, but in function. Both were associated with writing, magic, and the transmission of divine knowledge. The fusion birthed a hybrid spiritual authority, revered in Egyptian temples and Greek philosophical circles alike. And then a transformation began. Thoth as Hermes ceased to be just a god. He became a man, or at least something like a man. A sage, a philosopher, a prophet king who had lived in Egypt long ago and left behind a body of sacred writings. This fictional, but influential, figure, Hermes Trismegistus, meaning Hermes the thrice great, would become one of the most powerful intellectual symbols in the ancient and medieval worlds. The Hermetic corpus, echoes of an Egyptian mindset. Between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, a series of philosophical and mystical texts appeared in Greek, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. These works, later known collectively as the Hermetic corpus, explored themes like the structure of the cosmos, the nature of the divine, and the path of spiritual enlightenment. But beneath the Greek language and Neoplatonic framework, Egyptian patterns remained. The idea of the divine word, logos, as a creative force echoed the Egyptian view of Thoth's words birthing reality. The stress on ascent through knowledge, via inner purification and alignment with cosmic truth, mirrored the Egyptian journey of the soul through the underworld. The concept of duality of body and soul, heaven and earth, male and female reflected the Egyptian obsession with balance and opposites. One particularly famous Hermetic dialogue, the Poimandres, opens with a vision that might have been lifted from a Book of the Dead papyrus. Hermes experiences a dream in which a luminous being teaches him about the creation of the cosmos. The universe is described in layers, with the human soul descending from the divine and needing to ascend back through knowledge and virtue. Such a journey would have felt familiar to any educated Egyptian priest. But now it was cloaked in Greek metaphysics and cosmology. This Egyptian philosophical DNA, now translated and disguised, would later find new life in Arabic and Latin forms where it would influence mystics, theologians, and early scientists who had no idea how deeply Egyptian their thinking had become. From pagan roots to Christian mysticism. What's curious is how Hermes, a figure birthed from two pagan cultures, was absorbed so fully into Christian and Islamic mystical thought. Early Christian thinkers, particularly those in Alexandria, were torn. On the one hand, Hermes was a pagan. On the other, his writings spoke of one God, of a divine light, of the soul's yearning to return to its source. These themes sounded suspiciously Christian. Some, like Lactantius and Augustine, flirted with the idea that Hermes was a pagan prophet, someone who had dimly glimpsed the truth before Christ. This idea allowed Christian writers to quote Hermetic texts in sermons and theological arguments. The writings weren't divine, they argued, but they foreshadowed divinity. It was a convenient arrangement. The veil of the Coptic Christian tradition rooted in Egypt, respectful of its intellectual past, was the perfect context for this fusion to deepen. Monks and scribes in Christian Egypt, especially in Alexandria and the monastic communities of the desert, preserved fragments of Hermetic writings alongside scripture and apocrypha. They didn't always draw clear lines between sacred and profane, between Moses and Hermes. In the Coptic imagination, both were ancient voices speaking wisdom from a shared desert. Coptic manuscripts and the Hermetic threads. Some of the most compelling pieces of evidence for Hermes' survival in Christian Egypt come from the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945. Among the Gnostic Gospels and mystical treatises in Coptic, scholars found fragments of Hermetic-style texts modified, Christianized, but unmistakably part of that same intellectual lineage. Texts like the Discourse on the Eighth and Ninth, and the Asclepius hint at rituals of inner ascension, of preparing the mind to receive divine light, of traveling the cosmos through meditation. Though not strictly canonical in either religion, these works were copied, preserved, and read quietly, influencing Coptic mysticism and early Christian theology. It's telling that in some Egyptian monasteries, Hermes was not viewed with suspicion. He was part of the spiritual ecosystem, like Plato, like Pythagoras, like Moses. All were considered, in one way or another, seekers of divine truth. In this, the Coptic Church, often isolated from Rome and Constantinople, served as a unique intellectual bridge, quietly preserving a strand of wisdom the wider Christian world would only later rediscover. Why thrice great? Much ink has been spilled on the phrase Trismegistus, thrice great. Tradition holds it refers to Hermes being the greatest in three domains: philosophy, alchemy, and theology. But others suggest it was a translation of an Egyptian honorific used for Thoth, who was sometimes called great, great, great. Regardless, the repetition reinforces the reverence. In a world that had begun to flatten complex deities into simpler doctrines, Hermes was allowed to remain layered. He was the God who became a man, who became a prophet, who became a myth. And in that transformation, he became enduring. The enduring allure of hidden wisdom. To medieval minds, Christian, Muslim, or Jewish Hermes Trismegistus represented the possibility of ancient wisdom, hidden, forgotten, but not lost. A wisdom older than Scripture, yet not in conflict with it. A philosophy of the stars and the soul, written long ago in a desert land of temples and gods. His words, filtered through Greek, Coptic, Arabic, and Latin, would inspire alchemists in medieval Europe, Sufi mystics in the Islamic world, and esoteric thinkers of the Renaissance. But in all these retellings, the original thread, Egyptian order and cosmology, remained buried, like a river beneath the sand. Which raises a question. Did the medieval monks and scholars who revered Hermes Trismegistus truly understand the Egyptian world they were inheriting? Or were they merely interpreting shadows on the wall, never knowing the torch that had cast them? In the dim recesses of a monastic scriptoria or an Islamic madrasa, the scribes who copied texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus often had little idea that they were participating in a cross-cultural relay spanning centuries. Yet by the 9th and 10th centuries, Hermetic thought, birthed from the union of Egyptian Thoth and Greek Hermes, was quietly embedding itself in the intellectual frameworks of both Islamic and Christian theology. It did so not with armies or crusades, but through translations, one meticulous, sometimes flawed manuscript at a time. This section traces the afterlife of Hermes Trismegistus through the Islamic Golden Age, into the Latin West, and the evolving shadow he cast across alchemy, theology, and the idea of ancient wisdom itself. What emerges is a tale not of religious conquest, but of cultural absorption, linguistic ingenuity, and the deep memory of Egypt hidden in new forms. Baghdad's House of Wisdom and the Hermetic Surge. In the 8th century, under the Abbasid caliphs, the Islamic world witnessed a remarkable flowering of knowledge. Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, became a center of translation, drawing scholars from across the empire to render Greek, Persian, and Syriac texts into Arabic. Among the works prized for translation were Hermetic writings. Though originating in Greek, many of these had passed through Coptic scribes, particularly those associated with the Alexandrian Christian tradition. These scribes, often multilingual, acted as intellectual bridges between cultures. Some converted to Islam, others remained Christian, but nearly all understood that the wisdom they were transmitting had value far beyond dogma. For Islamic scholars, Hermes Trismegistus was not merely a curiosity. He was considered one of the ancient prophets, perhaps a form of Idris, a Quranic figure associated with writing, knowledge, and mystical ascent. This identification wasn't accidental. In the Quran, Surah Maryam, Idris is described as a man of truth and a prophet who was raised to a high station. Islamic thinkers like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Al-Kindi embraced this connection, incorporating Hermetic cosmology into metaphysics and ethical philosophy. It is in this moment that Hermes became safely Islamic, wrapped in a prophetic veil that allowed his writings to be examined, interpreted, and preserved without theological risk. And yet the Egyptian flavor remained. In works such as the Sur al-Khalqa, The Secret of Creation, Hermes is depicted not only as a philosopher but as a builder of pyramids, a master of astrology, and a communicator with celestial beings. These myths, embroidered and embellished, nonetheless reflect ancient Egyptian ideals: divine order, the soul's journey, and the role of the scholar as mediator between heaven and earth. Alchemy as a vessel of memory. Hermes Trismegistus became particularly central in one domain: alchemy. Though often misunderstood in modern terms as primitive chemistry, medieval alchemy was a spiritual philosophy as much as a physical one. The transmutation of metals mirrored the transformation of the soul. The base substance, lead, represented human imperfection. The philosopher's stone, or gold, symbolized purity, truth, and divine unity. These themes had deep Egyptian roots. In ancient Egypt, metals were associated with gods, gold with Ra, silver with the moon. The crafting of substances was not merely industrial but ritualistic. Temples had their own laboratories, and priest scribes carefully guarded formulae, not unlike their medieval successors. Texts like the Emerald Tablet, first appearing in Arabic around the 8th or 9th century, became central to both Islamic and European alchemical traditions. Its most famous line, "As above, so below," is often cited as the motto of Hermeticism. That phrase, as vague as it sounds, is actually deeply Egyptian. It reflects a cosmos where the terrestrial and celestial mirror one another, a universe of order and correspondence, ruled by principles far older than Plato or Galen. Through alchemy, Hermetic teachings preserved the Egyptian cosmological mindset, even as names changed and rituals evolved. A Latin friar in 12th century Paris might use Arabic translations of Hermetic texts without ever realizing that the language of refinement and purity he employed echoed temple incantations from 1500 BCE. The Latin translation movement and the rediscovery of Hermes. As Christian Europe slowly emerged from the so-called Dark Ages, scholars turned toward Islamic Spain, particularly Toledo, Seville, and Cordoba to access lost Greek and Arabic knowledge. The 12th century witnessed the Toledo translation movement, during which Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked together to render Arabic texts into Latin. Among them were Hermetic works, often under new titles, with fragmented attributions. Key figures such as Gerard of Cremona, Hugo of Santalla, and later Albertus Magnus translated and disseminated Hermetic alchemical texts across Europe. Though fragmented, these writings carried unmistakable traces of their Egyptian Greek origins. The Picatrix, a text of astral magic, claimed to draw on ancient sages including Hermes. The Liber Hermetis, a Latin astrological text, provided instructions on the soul's alignment with planetary influences. The Secretum Secretorum, attributed to Aristotle but packed with Hermetic themes, blurred the lines between medicine, ethics, and mysticism. These works, copied in monasteries, ended up on the desks of Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, and countless lesser-known monks and scholars. They were debated in universities, preached against in pulpits, and pored over in quiet cells by scribes searching for truth. And all the while, Egypt's intellectual voice muted, refracted spoke through them. The veil of Christian allegory. Hermes Trismegistus presented both a gift and a challenge to medieval Christian scholars. His ideas often aligned with Christian morality, the call to inner purification, the belief in a divine creator, the need for humility. But his lack of biblical lineage and the pagan flavor of his metaphors made him problematic. To resolve this, Christian writers often recast Hermetic texts as allegories. They interpreted metaphysical passages about stars and metals as moral lessons. The Emerald Tablet became a parable for resurrection. The one thing referenced in Hermetic cosmology became the Christian soul. This reinterpretation was not mere convenience, it was a strategy of survival. It allowed ancient wisdom to pass through ecclesiastical scrutiny. It also echoed earlier patterns. Just as the Copts had preserved Hermetic and Gnostic materials in Christian form, so too did European monks repurpose Hermes for their theological needs. But in doing so, they also blurred the historical thread. Over time, Hermes Trismegistus ceased to be Egyptian. He became a Christian figure, sometimes wise, sometimes heretical, but always ancient. And as the Egyptian origins of his writings faded from memory, a curious inversion occurred. The shadow remained, but the source was forgotten. An unlikely journey through time. From the scribes of Hermopolis to Coptic monks, from Baghdad translators to Parisian alchemists, Hermes Trismegistus traveled a remarkable arc. He survived not through dogma, but through adaptation, each era reshaping him to fit its own theological, philosophical, and scientific needs. And yet, like the buried Nile channels that irrigate distant fields, the Egyptian worldview flowed quietly beneath the surface. The divine order, Ma'at, became the moral law of the cosmos. The ascent of the soul found echoes in Christian mysticism and Sufi metaphysics. The ritual purity of matter persisted in alchemical laboratories from Cairo to Cologne. Even in the Renaissance, when scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola would elevate Hermes Trismegistus as the ultimate ancient sage, they were, unwittingly, drawing upon the long-preserved memory of Egyptian spirituality, filtered through Greek, Coptic, Arabic, and Latin lenses. Hermes had become many things, but the core remained the same: a mediator between worlds, a scribe of sacred truths, and a reminder that knowledge, like the soul, often survives in exile. Unresolved thought. In a world of passing empires and crumbling temples, why does the figure of Hermes endure? Is it because he speaks to our longing for a wisdom deeper than doctrine, one buried not in gold, but in memory? It is a strange irony that one of the most enduring voices in European and Islamic mystical thought, Hermes Trismegistus, was also the one whose origins were most thoroughly obscured. Born in the temples of Egypt, matured in the scriptoria of Coptic monks, translated by Muslim sages, and embraced by Christian mystics, Hermes ultimately became a universal cipher for ancient wisdom. And yet, by the end of the 17th century, his name had fallen into disrepute. The same Renaissance thinkers who once revered him as a primordial philosopher now dismissed him as a literary invention. The Enlightenment cast doubt on ancient sources. Hermes, it seemed, had outlived his usefulness. But in this final section, we pause to consider the layers of forgetting and remembering, and how, through the silt of centuries, the Egyptian voice beneath the Hermetic mask has begun to emerge once more. Collapse and doubt, the decline of Hermetic authority. During the Renaissance, Hermes Trismegistus enjoyed a golden resurgence. Translated into Latin by Marsilio Ficino in the 15th century, the Corpus Hermeticum was viewed as a set of sacred texts on par with the Hebrew prophets and Greek philosophers. Ficino, a devout Catholic and Neoplatonist, believed Hermes to be a prophet who foresaw the coming of Christ, an Egyptian sage whose writings offered a kind of pre-Christian revelation. This belief held firm for over a century. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola invoked Hermes in his famous oration on the dignity of man. Giordano Bruno, a Dominican friar turned cosmological mystic, wove Hermetic cosmology into his vision of an infinite universe. Alchemists, magicians, and theologians alike cited Hermes as a witness to eternal truths. But then came the scholars. In the early 1600s, Isaac Casaubon, a Protestant scholar with a sharp eye for textual inconsistencies, subjected the Hermetic texts to rigorous philological analysis. He concluded accurately that they were not written in the time of Moses, as previously thought, but likely in the 2nd or 3rd centuries CE, during the Roman rule of Egypt. This revelation did not merely redate the texts. It stripped Hermes of his prophetic aura. No longer a witness to divine truth before the Bible, he was now a latecomer, just another voice in the tumult of late antiquity. What followed was a steady decline in Hermetic credibility. Enlightenment thinkers dismissed him as a relic of superstition. The alchemical and mystical traditions that had carried Hermetic thought for centuries were now mocked or suppressed. Hermes faded from the canon of respected wisdom. But not completely. The hidden threads remain. While Hermes the person was largely discredited, the ideas remained stubbornly embedded in European thought. The concept of a corresponding cosmos, that microcosm reflects macrocosm, persisted in early science and medicine. The ideal of secret wisdom, accessible only through purification and initiation, influenced Romantic and occult philosophies. The reverence for ancient Egypt as a source of hidden truths continued to shape art, literature, and speculative theology. In this period, Egypt itself was being rediscovered not spiritually, but archaeologically. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt 1798–1801 sparked European fascination with hieroglyphs, temples, and monuments. The Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799, became the key to unlocking the Egyptian language. When Jean-François Champollion finally deciphered hieroglyphs in the 1820s, it was as though a veil had been lifted. Suddenly, the actual writings of ancient Egypt, not their filtered Greek versions, could be read again. But this posed a problem. The real Thoth, as found in Egyptian inscriptions and myths, did not quite resemble the philosophical Hermes of the Renaissance. He was more ritualistic, less contemplative. His wisdom was cosmic but grounded in myth and state religion, not abstract metaphysics. Hermes Trismegistus had been a mirror reflecting not Egypt as it was, but Egypt as others wanted it to be. Coptic custodians and the Fatting lineage. Throughout all these transformations, the Coptic Christian community, those direct descendants of ancient Egyptians, remained curiously silent in the Western imagination. Yet they had been the quiet custodians of Egyptian thought long before Champollion, and long after Ficino. Coptic monasteries continued to preserve liturgical texts, mystical writings, and even fragments of Hermetic material in the margins of religious works. Their traditions of silent prayer, ascetic purification, and ritual order echoed the very structures found in Hermetic and Egyptian philosophy. But in a world increasingly divided between modern and ancient, the Copts themselves were marginalized. Neither fully embraced by the West nor by dominant Islamic powers, they carried on their intellectual traditions in isolation, their libraries seldom visited, their manuscripts mostly unread. Only in recent decades have scholars begun to systematically catalog and study Coptic manuscripts, finding, again and again, faint fingerprints of Hermes in texts not considered Hermetic at all. A marginal note, a recurring metaphor of ascent, a structure of initiation embedded in a monastic rule. It is not overt, but it is there. The modern Hermetic revival. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Hermeticism saw another curious revival, this time through esoteric societies, occult revivals, and psychological spirituality. Groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Theosophical Society, and later, New Age movements, all invoked Hermes Trismegistus as a spiritual authority. But by then, the Egyptian roots were more symbolic than historical, more about mystique than scholarship. In academic circles, however, a new respect began to grow. Scholars like G.R.S. Mead, Tobin Siebers, Brian Copenhaver, and F. Rosenthal began re-evaluating Hermetic texts not as pseudoscience, but as windows into late antique religious thought. The field of Egyptian philosophy, long neglected, gained traction, revealing that ideas once attributed to Plato or Pythagoras had earlier analogues in Egyptian ethics and cosmology. Modern Egyptologists found that the structure of Hermetic dialogues mirrored Egyptian priestly instruction manuals, and that the path of purification outlined in Hermetic texts bore strong resemblance to Book of the Dead rituals. In other words, we had come full circle. Only now, with linguistic tools and historical context, could scholars finally hear the Egyptian voice beneath the Coptic veil, beneath the Arabic gloss, beneath the Latin appropriation. And that voice, far from mystical nonsense, spoke of a world governed by order, balance, and the quiet labor of knowing the self. A voice worth listening to. What makes Hermes Trismegistus remarkable is not his authenticity as a historical figure. He almost certainly never existed, but his role as a vessel for collective memory. In him, we see how cultures preserve what they cannot fully comprehend, how monks copy what they cannot fully read, how theologians baptize what they cannot fully accept. Hermes survived not because people agreed on his identity, but because they needed him. As a symbol of ancient legitimacy, as a mouthpiece for ethical wisdom, as a mediator between opposites body and soul, Egypt and Greece, faith and reason. In many ways, he is history's palimpsest, a reused parchment bearing layers of meaning, all slightly visible beneath the other. And if we listen closely in the silence between those layers, we might hear the original scribe, bent over a table in an Egyptian temple, whispering truths that have no name, only shape. Final reflection, what was lost in what remains. The story of Hermes Trismegistus is, ultimately, a story of transmission under pressure. It's about how a civilization's deepest ideas about the divine, the soul, and the structure of reality can travel thousands of years and change forms without vanishing. It reminds us that knowledge doesn't always survive in power or prestige or clarity. Sometimes it survives in obscurity, carried by those who don't understand its origins but know, somehow, that it must be saved. So when we speak today of cosmic balance, sacred knowledge, or the pursuit of inner transformation, we may be reaching knowingly or not toward the thrice great scribe of Egypt. And if Hermes was listening, he might only smile. He has, after all, been speaking for a very long time. Story 3. The Desert and the Divine, Early Christian Ascetics and Egyptian Monks. There are places in Egypt where the wind speaks louder than men and time drips like water from a cracked clay pot. In these dry and silent valleys known as wadis, the seeds of Christian asceticism were first sown. The idea of a man abandoning the world to seek God is not new. Yet, in Egypt between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE, this abandonment was formalized into a movement. Not just a personal spiritual journey, but the birth of a way of life, a path, a discipline, a rule. This was the beginning of Christian monasticism, and at its heart was Egypt's desert not as metaphor, but as reality. It is easy to imagine the desert as empty, but in the 4th century, it was filled with seekers. These early Christian monks, known as anchorites, were heirs to both the theological ferment of Alexandria and the mystical heritage of the Egyptian landscape. And in their daily struggles, they would establish patterns of religious life that shaped not only Eastern Christianity, but much of the Western world. This section explores the dawn of the ascetic movement in Egypt, the spiritual logic of the desert, and the men and women who carved holiness out of dust and heat. The silence of the desert. To early Christian thinkers, Egypt was a place both feared and revered. It was the land of plagues, the seat of Pharaoh, the site of the Exodus. But it was also the refuge of the Holy Family, where Mary and Joseph fled with the infant Jesus. By the 3rd century, Alexandria had become a hub of Christian theology and debate, home to Origen, Clement, and the early seeds of the Nicene faith. But it was also a place of conflict, doctrinal disputes, persecution, imperial suspicion. For many Christians, the city offered too much. Too many words, too much noise, too much temptation. And so they left. Not to found churches or preach to the masses, but to retreat into caves, abandoned tombs, palm-shaded crevices in the eastern desert. There they sought a new form of martyrdom, the martyrdom of solitude. One of the earliest and most famous was Anthony the Great. Born around 251 CE in Rome and Egypt, Anthony was a wealthy Christian who, after hearing the gospel verse, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell what you have and give to the poor," took the command literally. He gave away his possessions and ventured deep into the desert. He would not be the last. Anthony and the Anchorites. Anthony's biography, written by Athanasius of Alexandria, is not just a story of faith, it's a template. In this account, Anthony battles demons real or imagined, fasts for days, lives in abandoned fortresses and gains spiritual insight through suffering. His solitude is not total, though disciples come to him, drawn by his reputation for wisdom and holiness. This model of the anchorite, the solitary monk, quickly spread. But what Anthony and others practiced was not aimless isolation. It was structured withdrawal, a life governed by fasting, prayer, manual labor, and reading. In other words, order in the wilderness. Egypt, with its dry climate and abundance of old tombs and ruins, provided the perfect landscape. The environment itself encouraged simplicity. Food was scarce, water hard-won, distractions few. These monks saw the desert as a place of spiritual testing, much as Jesus had faced in the wilderness. But unlike a temporary fast, their retreat was permanent, a renunciation not only of possessions, but of self. Pachomius and the communal turn. As more people sought out anchorites like Anthony, it became clear that solitude was paradoxically becoming a crowded practice. In response, a former soldier named Pachomius introduced a different form of monasticism, cenobitic life, or communal monasticism. Where Anthony had stressed isolation, Pachomius emphasized order and fraternity. Around 320 CE, he founded his first monastery at Tabenisi in Upper Egypt. Monks lived together, worked together, prayed in unison. Their day was structured: early prayers, manual labor, weaving, farming, meals in silence, evening psalms. Unlike anchorites, Pachomian monks followed a set of written guidelines governing behavior, speech, dress, and worship. This rule would go on to influence later monastic systems, including Benedict's rule in 6th century Italy. Pachomius himself had been inspired by a vision of angels dressed as monks, and many of his successors treated the monastic community as a heavenly imitation, a prelude to the order of the afterlife. In his vision, the desert became not a place of death, but of transfiguration. The role of women in the desert. It wasn't only men who fled into the wilderness. Female monasticism also took root in Egypt, though it has been more poorly documented. Some women joined monastic communities organized similarly to the Pachomian system. Others lived as solitaries, often disguised or protected by spiritual brothers. The story of St. Syncletica, a wealthy Alexandrian woman who gave up her inheritance to live in a tomb outside the city, was preserved among the sayings of the Desert Fathers, an anthology that included women. She once said, "There are many who live in the mountains and behave as though they were in the towns, and they are wasting their time. It is better to be among crowds and keep calm and peaceful than to live in solitude with a harried spirit." This tension between geography and intention was key. The desert was not inherently holy. It was the inner discipline that mattered. The desert only provided the space to develop it. Tools of the ascetic life. To the outsider, early Egyptian monks might seem like madmen living in holes, eating barely anything, renouncing society. But their lives were governed by rhythms and tools, passed down through oral instruction and eventually text. The Psalms, recited daily, often from memory. Manual labor, used to support the community and discipline the body. Silence, not as absence but as a practice of listening. Spiritual elders, Abba/Ammas, who provided guidance through example and story. The most famous textual relic of this era is the Apophthegmata Patrum, the sayings of the Desert Fathers. Collected between the 5th and 7th centuries, it includes pithy wisdom on humility, anger, lust, and prayer. One example. Abba Moses said, "Sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." The cell was not a prison, but a space of transformation. There, the monk encountered his own mind and, ideally, God. The desert as memory. The Egyptian desert was not only a setting, it was a memory palace. It bore the marks of pharaonic religious practice, structured ritual, sacred geography, veneration of the afterlife, and the Christian monks of late antiquity were not unaware of this heritage. Some anchorites dwelled in former tombs, a poignant reversal of purpose. Spaces once built for death now hosted spiritual rebirth. In their strict rules, choreographed prayers, and belief in the sacredness of space and time, these monks were consciously or not heirs to Egypt's religious order. The gods had changed, the theology had changed, but the practices of devotion, the discipline of the body, and the quest for purity remained. The desert beyond Egypt. The ascetic model born in Egypt did not stay there. From the 4th century onward it spread to Syria and Palestine, where monks like Jerome and Paula adopted desert withdrawal, to North Africa, where Augustine admired and emulated the Egyptian model, to Gaul, Ireland, and Italy, where monastic orders arose that traced their origin to Anthony and Pachomius. In a way, Egypt became the monastic womb of Christendom, its desert a blueprint for every cloister, cell, and abbey that followed. But while the structures were copied, the spiritual texture of the Egyptian experience, its blend of silence, space, and ancient symbolism, was never fully replicated. The true desert, as these early monks knew, could not be imported. It had to be entered. Unresolved thought. In a world now filled with noise and instant gratification, what does it mean to go into the desert? Can silence still teach, as it once did under the Egyptian sun? By the 5th century CE, the deserts of Egypt were no longer simply places of retreat, they had become landscapes of structured devotion. What began as solitary withdrawal had matured into a discipline, a pattern of life known as monasticism, whose roots were deeply entwined with the land, culture, and spirituality of late ancient Egypt. From scattered hermits to cohesive communities, from caves and tombs to complex compounds with chapels, granaries, and guest houses, Egyptian monasticism evolved not only in form but in philosophy. And central to that philosophy was a question: how can a person live a life pleasing to God continually, sustainably, and in community? This section traces the crystallization of organized monastic life in Egypt, focusing on its internal rhythms, social order, and economic functions, and showing how its impact extended far beyond the Nile Valley. The rule and the rhythm. We often imagine monks as removed from the world, detached, idle, perpetually praying. But the early Egyptian monasteries were working communities, with a rhythm as tight and regulated as a military outpost. Under Pachomius, the Cenobitic model was codified into something astonishingly efficient. Monks were assigned to groups of 10, each with a leader. Units were organized by profession: weaving, agriculture, pottery, carpentry, cooking. Every day began with prayer, continued with manual labor, and ended in collective worship. Meals were eaten in silence, punctuated only by readings from Scripture. Strict obedience was enforced. Monks could not even speak without permission. This rhythm was not merely practical, it was spiritual. Every act, from harvesting to baking bread, was framed as a form of devotion. Labor was not a distraction from prayer, but a continuation of it. The goal was self-emptying kenosis, a gradual stripping away of ego, desire, and distraction, until only the bare soul remained, open to God. The spiritual hierarchy. Within the monastery, not all monks were equal, nor was that considered a flaw. Egyptian monasticism embraced a hierarchical order modeled on the spiritual world. Elders, abbas, and ammas were revered not for titles, but for spiritual maturity, their patience, wisdom, and insight in guiding others. These elders were living libraries, sources of oral teaching, moral instruction, and sometimes sharp rebukes. Their authority came from experience, not appointment. In the sayings of the Desert Fathers, this dynamic is clear. A brother asked Abba Poemen, "What shall I do?" The old man said, "Go, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." Monastic life, was full of such interactions, brief exchanges rich with layered meaning. This oral tradition was eventually written down, creating a spiritual literature that would influence Christian thought for centuries. This model of elder and disciple would later shape spiritual direction practices across the Christian world. Economic engines of faith. Though focused on renunciation, Egyptian monasteries were not economically passive. In fact, many became self-sufficient mini-economies producing goods, managing farms, and even trading with nearby towns. Monks produced textiles, woven cloth and rope, pottery, amphorae, storage jars, domestic wares, agricultural produce, dates, olives, barley, manuscripts, copied texts in Greek and Coptic, both sacred and secular. This labor was not simply a means of survival, it was a theological practice. By working, monks enacted Genesis, command to till the earth, while also subduing their bodily impulses through toil. Some of the larger monasteries, like the White Monastery, Deir el-Abiad, near Sohag, employed hundreds of monks and lay workers. These were not solitary dens of mystics but bustling centers of production and learning, visited by pilgrims, scholars, and even emperors. In time, the fame of these Egyptian monasteries would reach Rome, Constantinople, and beyond. A living archive, books, memory, and transmission. One of the most enduring legacies of Egyptian monasticism is its role in preserving knowledge. Monks, especially in the 4th to 6th centuries, copied not only scripture but also commentaries, sermons, hymns, and even classical texts. Scriptoria, dedicated rooms for writing, became central to monastic compounds. In the dry Egyptian climate, many of these manuscripts survived for centuries, hidden in walls, buried in storage pits, or lost in abandoned monasteries. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, is a case in point. This remarkable cache of Gnostic texts written in Coptic was buried by monks who likely disagreed with the content, but still believed the texts too sacred to destroy. Coptic monks, in particular, held a reverence for preservation, even when they did not fully approve of a text's theology. This impulse, rooted perhaps in ancient Egyptian traditions of scribal discipline, ensured that future generations would have access to a much broader range of Christian and philosophical texts than doctrinal orthodoxy might have allowed. In this way, Egyptian monks became not just practitioners of holiness, but archivists of thought, pilgrimage, and the reputation of the desert. As Egyptian monasticism developed, it began to attract not just locals, but visitors from across the Christian world. Pilgrims came from Asia Minor and the Byzantine Empire, Greece, seeking wisdom and spiritual renewal, Rome and North Africa, looking for precedents to bring back to new monastic foundations. One famous visitor was John Cassian, a 5th century monk who spent time among the Egyptian communities and later established monasteries in Gaul, modern-day France. His writings, especially the Conferences, introduced Eastern monastic principles to the Western Church. He emphasized the discipline of the cell, the practice of unceasing prayer, the fight against the 8 evil thoughts, precursors to the later 7 deadly sins. Cassian's work deeply influenced Benedict of Nursia, whose rule of St. Benedict became the cornerstone of Western monasticism. In this way, the practices of Egyptian monks became the foundation of Western religious life, not through conquest, but through replication and admiration. Theological and cultural tensions. As monasticism spread, tensions emerged between local traditions and imperial orthodoxy. Egypt, in particular, became a flashpoint. After the Council of Chalcedon, 451 CE, many Egyptian Christians rejected the imperial definition of Christ's dual nature. They became known as Miaphysites, and their church, the Coptic Orthodox Church, was increasingly marginalized by Byzantine authorities. Monasteries became strongholds of local resistance not militarily, but culturally. They preserved Coptic language, art, and liturgy, even as Greek became dominant in church and state. This resistance often expressed itself quietly in icons painted with distinctive Egyptian features, in hymns that invoked the desert saints, in rules of life that emphasized local tradition over imperial decrees. In this context, the desert became not just a place of holiness, but of identity, a refuge from politics, but also a base of cultural preservation. The physical legacy, architecture and ruins. Many of Egypt's ancient monasteries still stand, some as ruins, others still functioning. The most famous is the monastery of St. Anthony, located in the eastern desert near the Red Sea. Founded in the 4th century near the cave where Anthony lived, it remains active to this day. Others, like St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai, though not in Egypt proper, owe much to the Egyptian model, especially in terms of architecture, scriptoria, and iconography. Monastic buildings followed clear principles: enclosure walls for security and spiritual separation, central chapels or churches, dormitories and refectories for communal living, workshops and gardens for self-sufficiency. Even in their architecture, the monasteries reflected Egyptian religious instincts, symmetry, alignment with natural features, and a profound respect for the order of sacred space. Unresolved thought. If the desert taught monks to live with less, to work in silence, and to embrace humility, what does our modern world teach us in its place? What are we becoming in the absence of stillness? By the dawn of the second millennium, much of the Christian world had changed. Rome had fallen and risen again through the papacy. Byzantium clung to theological rigor even as its political grip weakened. The Western Church was beginning to centralize, building cathedrals and forming scholastic institutions. New religious orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, Cistercians, spread rapidly through Europe. But in Egypt, the desert still whispered. Though the golden age of Egyptian monasticism had passed, its spiritual DNA persisted in texts, traditions, and the very bones of those long-buried monks whose lives of obscurity had shaped a global faith. This final section explores the long tale of Egyptian monasticism, how it declined, endured, and continues to echo through Christian thought, even today. From Anchorhold to Abbey, the spread of desert ideals. The practices first developed in Egypt's solitude, structured community, spiritual hierarchy, and labor as devotion found eager adoption throughout the Christian world. In the West, monastic orders like the Benedictines borrowed directly from the Egyptian model. The division of time into canonical hours, set aside for prayer and work. The emphasis on obedience, poverty, and stability. The idea that a monastery should be a school for the service of God, echoing Pachomian ideals. The rule of St. Benedict even instructs monks to read the lives of the Desert Fathers, regularly treating their sayings not as remote curiosities, but as living instruction. Meanwhile, in the East, particularly in the Byzantine and Syriac worlds, the Egyptian desert continued to be venerated as the spiritual heartland of monasticism. Pilgrimages to the cells of ancient monks became a form of devotional journey. Their relics were treasured, their sayings quoted in homilies and ascetical treatises. Yet, even as their influence grew, the Egyptian monasteries themselves were entering a long period of uncertainty and decline. Struggles under Islamic rule. After the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century, Coptic Christians found themselves under new governance. At first, Islamic rule was relatively tolerant. The monasteries continued to operate, and many monks learned Arabic to communicate with the ruling class. But over time, political and economic pressures mounted. Jizya, non-Muslim tax, burdened Christian communities, including monks. Periods of local unrest or centralized repression led to the destruction or abandonment of some monasteries. The Coptic language began to fade in daily use, replaced by Arabic, leading to a loss of cultural continuity. Despite this, many monasteries persisted, their remote locations offering some protection. The monastery of St. Macarius in Wadi el-Natron maintained an unbroken monastic presence from the 4th century into the present. Others, like the Red Monastery and White Monastery, weathered cycles of destruction and repair. The monks adapted. They prayed in Arabic. They copied texts in new scripts. But the rhythm of desert life, the architecture of holiness first carved out by Anthony and Pachomius, remained. The Coptic revival and the return to the desert. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Egypt underwent enormous transformation politically, economically, and religiously. Yet even amid these shifts, a Coptic monastic revival began. One pivotal figure was Mata el-Meskin, Matthew the Poor, a 20th century monk who led the revival of monastic life at the monastery of St. Macarius. Emphasizing simplicity, prayer, and contemplative silence, he returned to the ancient ideals of the Desert Fathers. His writings, widely read across Orthodox and Catholic traditions alike, reawakened interest in desert spirituality as a modern discipline, not escapism, but a response to modernity's spiritual fatigue. Similarly, Pope Shenouda III, Patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church, 1971-2012, had himself been a monk and encouraged others to enter the monastic life. Under his leadership, many ancient monasteries were rebuilt, repopulated, and strengthened. Today, Coptic monasticism remains vibrant home to thousands of monks across dozens of sites, some modern, some as ancient as Christianity itself. The desert, it seems, still calls. The desert in the Western imagination. Even in places far from Egypt, the spiritual legacy of the Egyptian desert lingers. In Ireland, the tradition of the desert anchorite inspired the founding of monasteries on remote islands like Skellig Michael. In England, anchoresses like Julian of Norwich lived enclosed lives in imitation of the Egyptian hermits. In France, the Carthusian order, founded by St. Bruno in the 11th century, required vows of solitude and silence modeled on the Desert Fathers. In literature, the image of the desert monk became a symbol of purity and authenticity, someone who rejected the world not in despair, but in search of the divine. This romanticization often missed the gritty realism of monastic life, the hunger, heat, boredom, and psychological strain of isolation. But it kept the ideal alive that somewhere, in some quiet place, holiness was being cultivated by hands that asked for no recognition. The psychological desert, inner solitude in a noisy world. In modern spirituality, going to the desert has become a metaphor. Writers like Henry Nouwen, Thomas Merton, and Simone Weil spoke of interior, desert states of emptiness, silence, or suffering that prepare the soul for encounter with the divine. These deserts are not physical but psychological or spiritual. They demand attention, restraint, listening. Merton, a Trappist monk deeply influenced by Eastern Orthodoxy and the Desert Fathers, once wrote, "The monk is not a special kind of man, but every man is a special kind of monk if he would only descend into the silence of his own heart." This modern reimagining reveals the lasting relevance of the Egyptian desert, not as a relic, but as a model for spiritual resilience in every age. Lessons from the desert. What do we learn from those early Egyptian monks? Discipline over emotion. They taught that spiritual growth was not a feeling, but a practice, a repetition of small acts, day after day. Silence as strength. In an age of constant communication, their silence challenges our assumptions about wisdom and presence. Community and solitude. Whether alone or in a monastery, they emphasized mutual accountability. Even hermits were part of a broader network of faith. integration of body and spirit. They wove labor into prayer, treating work not as a secular task, but as a spiritual act. Transmission through humility. They rarely wrote for fame or influence, yet their sayings have endured for 1,700 years. The desert, then, was not about escape. It was about focus, a narrowing of attention to what mattered, and a willingness to let everything else fall away. Closing the circle, Egypt's quiet centrality. It is tempting to relegate Egypt's role in Christian history to the margins, remote monasteries, minor traditions, forgotten texts. But that would be a mistake. Egypt was not peripheral, it was foundational. From the earliest anchorites to the modern monastic revivals, from Coptic scribes preserving lost gospels to anonymous monks copying scripture in dim candlelight, Egypt has always offered the skeleton of devotion, a structure that endures even when flesh fails. It taught the church how to pray without ceasing, how to live without possessing, how to listen without speaking. It taught the church how to be still. Final reflection: the desert lives on. The world has changed. The deserts are different now, less remote, more encroached upon by roads and tourists. But in small cells, in quiet corners of monastic communities, and perhaps even in the modern city dweller seeking a quiet moment amid digital chaos, the spirit of the desert remains. The monk is still there, sitting, praying, listening. And the wind still moves through the wadi, whispering lessons no less vital today than they were 17 centuries ago. Story 4. Isis in the Cloister. Traces of the goddess in Marian iconography. She stands on the altar, clothed in blue and white, her eyes lowered, arms open in compassion. In her arms is a child, calm, serene, and holy. This image, instantly familiar to Christians across the world, is the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus, Queen of Heaven, and the most venerated female figure in the Christian tradition. But centuries earlier, in another temple, another land, and another belief system, a similar image prevailed. There, another mother stood, often seated on a throne, holding her divine child. Her name was Isis, and the child she cradled was Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship and the sky. To modern eyes, the resemblance between these two iconographies, Isis and Horus, Mary and Jesus, is striking. But is this similarity superficial, symbolic, or a direct line of influence? This story seeks to unpack the complex and layered relationship between the Egyptian goddess Isis and the Christian figure of the Virgin Mary, focusing on their visual representations, theological resonances, and the transmission of maternal iconography from ancient Egyptian religion into Christian devotion. Isis, the divine mother of Egypt. In the pantheon of ancient Egypt, Isis was unique. Though other goddesses existed, Hathor, Nephthys, Sekhmet, Isis embodied the most comprehensive spectrum of divine femininity. Motherhood and fertility, magic and healing, mourning and protection, cosmic authority and queenship. She was both tender and powerful, mortal and divine. Her myth, perhaps the most emotionally resonant in Egyptian religion, centers on her husband Osiris, who is murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set. Isis, through perseverance, magic, and mourning, finds his scattered body parts and resurrects him long enough to conceive a son, Horus, whom she raises in hiding. This narrative made Isis more than just a deity. She was a model of female devotion, divine suffering, and maternal protection. Her role as protector of Horus, often depicted nursing the child or sheltering him with her wings, became a potent image of nurturing strength. It was an image so widespread and beloved that it survived long after Egypt's temples fell silent. The decline of paganism and the persistence of imagery. By the 4th century CE, as Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, Egypt's traditional religious structures began to collapse. Temples were closed or repurposed, priests were defunded, sacred rituals faded. but people do not discard their symbols so easily. Even as Isis worship officially ended, her iconography lived on. The goddess, so often represented in sculpture, relief, and painted stele, had left behind a visual vocabulary, one that could be recognized across languages and belief systems. The image of Isis nursing Horus, known in Egypt as the Isis lactans, was particularly resilient. Found in countless temples, amulets, and home shrines, it was one of the most accessible and intimate portrayals of divinity. And as the Virgin Mary's cult grew in the early Christian centuries, especially in Egypt, it is not hard to see how this powerful maternal form was carried forward, albeit in new theological dress. Coptic Christianity and the cultural bridge. In no place was this continuity more evident than in Egypt itself, where Coptic Christianity developed as both a religious and cultural tradition rooted in ancient Egyptian identity. The Coptic Church, which emerged in the 1st–2nd centuries CE, retained many aspects of Egypt's religious temperament. A strong emphasis on sacred ritual and iconography. A belief in intercession, particularly through saints and the Virgin. A reverence for mystery, suffering, and the afterlife. Mary, in this context, became more than just the mother of Jesus. She was a cosmic intercessor, a source of healing, and a protector against evil roles long associated with Isis. In fact, many of the early titles of Mary used by Coptic Christians, such as Theotokos, God-bearer, Queen of Heaven, Mother of Light, and Ever-Virgin, mirror epithets previously applied to Isis. This was not mere imitation. Rather, it reflected a cultural and symbolic continuity in which older religious instincts found new theological expression. Visual echoes, from Isis lactans to Madonna and Child. The transition from Isis Horus imagery to Mary Jesus iconography is most clearly seen in art. The earliest surviving images of the Virgin and Child in Christian art date to the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, often found in catacombs or domestic shrines. These depictions are notably similar to the Isis lactans motif. The mother seated, child on her lap or held close. The child facing outward or nursing. A calm, serene demeanor suggesting divine intimacy. In some instances, Christian artists reused pagan statues, simply reinterpreting the figures for a new purpose. A statue of Isis and Horus could become, with minimal modification, an image of Mary and Jesus. This was not deceptive, but adaptive. For new converts, especially in Egypt, the familiarity of the image eased the transition between belief systems. The emotional power of the mother and child remained intact, even as theological meanings shifted. As Christianity spread, this image became universal, eventually refined into the Madonna and Child portraits of Byzantine and Western European tradition. But its emotional core, the sanctity of maternal care, was already well established in the Nile Valley. Theology of the mother, mirrored attributes. Beyond iconography, there are deeper theological parallels between Isis and Mary that reveal how Egyptian religious thought may have shaped Christian understandings of divine motherhood. Attribute: Isis, Mary, mother of a divine child. Horus, divine son and savior of Egypt. Jesus, divine son and savior of humanity. Queen of heaven, worshipped as queen, often crowned with solar disk. Referred to as Queen of Heaven in Catholic tradition. Intercessor for the faithful. Protector and healer, prayed to by individuals. Intercessor for prayers, comforter of the afflicted. Suffering and mourning. Mourns Osiris, protector of the dead. Mother of sorrows, weeps at the foot of the cross. Universal devotion. Worshipped across the Mediterranean. Venerated globally by Catholics and Orthodox Christians. Though the theological content is distinct, Mary is not a goddess, but a human elevated by grace. The structure of devotion is surprisingly similar. In both cases, the mother figure provides access to the divine, embodying traits of compassion, endurance, and cosmic importance. These similarities were not accidental. They reflect centuries of cultural layering, in which older religious symbols were reinterpreted rather than erased. A feminine continuity across belief. Some scholars argue that the transition from Isis to Mary represents more than symbolic inheritance. It is part of a deeper human religious instinct, the need for a divine feminine presence. In patriarchal religious systems, this presence is often secondary, yet it remains vital. Mary, like Isis, functions as a compassionate counterbalance to a male divine hierarchy. She listens, nurtures, heals. She is accessible where God may seem distant. In this way, Mary fulfills many of the roles once played by Isis, not because early Christians deliberately borrowed from paganism, but because the human need for maternal divinity persisted. And Egypt, long a land of goddesses and sacred mothers, was particularly fertile soil for this spiritual continuity. Unresolved thought. When we look upon a statue of the Virgin and Child, are we only seeing Christian devotion, or are we also glimpsing the long memory of a civilization that believed divinity could be found in the arms of a mother? In the soft glow of candle-lit chapels across the Christian world, the figure of the Virgin Mary reigns serene, gently distant, enveloped in layers of symbolic language. She is Theotokos, the God-bearer. She is Mater Dolorosa, the sorrowful mother. She is Regina Caeli, the Queen of Heaven. Her image stands at the intersection of devotion and doctrine. But how did this image form? And how much of it reflects the persistence of older divine archetypes, particularly those rooted in Egyptian tradition? As we move deeper into this story, we peel back the veil of theology to examine how Christian doctrine both absorbed and redefined the maternal sacred feminine. We will explore the elevation of Mary, the rebranding of Isis, and the delicate balance between cultural inheritance and religious innovation that shaped Marian thought. The Council of Ephesus and the Theotokos debate. The year was 431 CE. The Roman Empire, though divided between East and West, still maintained a measure of cohesion under Christian rule. At Ephesus, an ancient city in Asia Minor known for its temple to the goddess Artemis, bishops gathered for a theological showdown. Was Mary the mother of God, or merely the mother of Christ's human nature? This was more than semantics. It touched the very foundation of Christological doctrine, how Jesus was understood as both divine and human. The council ultimately declared Mary Theotokos a Greek term meaning God-bearer. This title became central to Orthodox Christian theology and opened the door to heightened Marian devotion, particularly in the Eastern churches. In Egypt, this declaration had profound implications. It validated the veneration of Mary already developing among Coptic Christians and allowed her to take on a role that bore striking similarities to that of Isis. Not a goddess, but a vessel of the divine, intercessor, and protectress. Iconography as theological argument. The early church understood the power of images. While written theology was debated by bishops, visual theology, the art and icons that adorned churches, quietly transmitted ideas to the laity. And in this realm, the visual language of Isis was both available and effective. Images of Mary from the 5th–7th centuries, especially in Egypt and Syria, often show her enthroned as Isis had been, veiled as a sign of sacred presence, holding or nursing Jesus in a pose near identical to Isis Lactans, flanked by angels or saints, echoing older depictions of goddesses surrounded by divine figures. In some Byzantine icons, Mary is shown gesturing toward Christ in a pose known as Hodgetria, she who shows the way. This form was less maternal, more regal and instructive. Yet even here, parallels to Isis as teacher and protector of Horus persist. As Marian devotion deepened, Her iconography expanded, incorporating symbols of fertility, fruit, flowers, light stars, halos, and queenship, crowns, thrones. These were not exclusively Egyptian in origin, but they overlapped so closely with the symbolic world of Isis that their continuity is difficult to ignore. From pagan queen to Christian mother, recasting the feminine. It's important to understand that Isis was not merely absorbed, she was recast. Christian theology was clear. Mary was not divine in herself. She was exalted because of her obedience, her purity, her role in salvation history. She was the model disciple, not a goddess to be worshipped. Yet the emotional, visual, and devotional functions of Mary often filled the same needs that Isis had previously answered. Protection for the vulnerable, comfort for the grieving, intercession for the sick, presence in childbirth and parenting. Indeed, many of the ancient feast days associated with Isis, especially those linked to motherhood, fertility, and lamentation, found Christian counterparts in Marian feasts. For example, ancient festival, Isis, Christian parallel, Mary, Navigum Ascites March, protection of sailors and travelers, Feast of the Annunciation, March 25, Mary's yes to the divine journey, Lamentation of Isis, mourning Osiris' death, Our Lady of Sorrows, Sept 15, Mary at the foot of the cross, birth of Horus, late December, celebration of divine child, Christmas, Dec 25, birth of Jesus through Mary. Though the theological framework changed, the liturgical rhythm echoed earlier patterns of honoring the sacred feminine at seasonal transitions. The Coptic experience, Mary as national and spiritual mother. In Egypt, Mary became more than a spiritual figure. She became a symbol of cultural identity. After centuries of foreign rule, sectarian marginalization, and religious tension, Egyptian Christians, especially the Copts, found in Mary a figure who reflected their endurance. Mary appeared in visions, was credited with miraculous healings, and became the subject of local pilgrimage. Coptic hymns described her not just in biblical terms, but with a poetic intimacy rooted in Egyptian devotional language. One hymn reads, "You are the second heaven, the spiritual treasure, the pure gold of Ophir." These layers of imagery, cosmic, royal, elemental, mirror how Isis had once been described, as the throne, the eye, the star. In this way, Egyptian Christians reasserted their religious imagination, transforming older symbols into new affirmations of faith. The goddess had become a saint, but her cultural function remained. Islamic Egypt and the respect for Mary. Even as Egypt came under Islamic rule, the figure of Mary retained cross-religious reverence. In the Quran, Mary Maryam is the only woman mentioned by name. She is described as chosen above all women of her time, a virgin who miraculously bore a prophet, Isa, or Jesus, a woman of piety and spiritual strength. For Egyptian Muslims and Christians alike, Mary remained a unifying figure respected across faith lines, venerated in different ways, but culturally embedded in Egypt's religious life. In some Egyptian households, icons of Mary and images of Islamic calligraphy sit side by side. Shrines dedicated to Mary are visited by people of both faiths. This coexistence further demonstrates the deep-rooted symbolic power of the Sacred Mother in Egyptian spirituality. Cultural echo or spiritual archetype. Was the continuity from Isis to Mary a matter of deliberate appropriation, cultural inertia, or archetypal symbolism? Scholars differ. Some argue that the Church consciously reused familiar images to ease conversion, especially among illiterate populations, who responded to visual language more than doctrine. Others suggest that symbolic forms naturally recur across civilizations, that the mother cradling a child is a universal image, not uniquely Egyptian. Still others note that the overlap was too close to be coincidence, especially given the geographic and historical continuity in Egypt. In truth, it is likely a convergence of all three. Cultural forms persist. Visual language shapes belief. And the deep need for a divine feminine, someone who nurtures, suffers, intercedes, ensures that such figures are never easily forgotten. Unresolved thought. If the Sacred Mother appears again and again in different forms, what does this say about our human longing for comfort, for mercy, and for strength wrapped in gentleness? In the chapel of a small Coptic monastery, a candle flickers before an icon of the Virgin Mary. She is veiled in deep blue, her eyes cast downward in eternal compassion. In her arms rests the infant Christ, serene, sacred, divine. The walls around her are lined with murals, angels, saints, crosses, stars. Yet here in Egypt, where once the goddess Isis held her infant son Horus in a near-identical pose, the past seems close woven into the very fabric of devotion. This final section explores how the sacred feminine, once embodied by Isis, has not only survived but adapted, persisted, and subtly shaped the contours of Christian thought. We will examine how Marian devotion developed in the Middle Ages and beyond, how it mirrored ancient religious instincts, and how perhaps unconsciously Isis continued to walk cloistered halls in another name. Medieval Marian devotion, a growing flame. By the Middle Ages, the figure of the Virgin Mary had become central to Western Christian life, not just as the mother of Jesus, but as an object of personal piety, intercessory hope, and symbolic richness. In art, she was the subject of thousands of altarpieces, frescoes, and manuscripts. In liturgy, she was honored in feasts like the Annunciation, Assumption, and Nativity of Mary. In architecture, cathedrals across Europe were named in her honor: Notre Dame, Santa Maria Maggiore, Mariazell. The image of the Madonna and Child proliferated, taking on regional characteristics: Black Madonnas in Spain and Poland, weeping Madonnas in Italy, enthroned Marys in France and Germany. But across these variations, a core structure remained: Mary as a maternal figure of holiness and mercy. Her pose seated, holding the Christ child, was now more Christianized than ever, but the echo of Isis Lactan still lingered in its posture, serenity, and symbolism. The Marian cult and the feminine ideal. As Marian devotion intensified, so too did Marian theology. Scholars and mystics debated and elaborated her virtues. Perpetual virginity, immaculate conception, assumption into heaven, spiritual motherhood of all believers. While these doctrines were firmly rooted in Christian dogma, they also created a symbolic archetype that resonated beyond theology. Mary became the model for motherhood, both biological and spiritual; purity, especially for women entering religious life; intercession, offering a softer path to divine grace than Christ's judgment. She was, for many medieval Christians, more accessible than God and more understanding than saints. Pilgrims prayed to her not because she was divine, but because she was close, a mother who could plead on their behalf. This maternal intimacy recalls not only the emotional register of Isis, but also her cosmic role in Egyptian religion, the one who bridges the mortal and divine, not with power, but with love. Isis in disguise, the debate over syncretism. Some modern scholars argue that the Virgin Mary absorbed not just the imagery of Isis, but her theological space in the religious imagination. This view, while compelling, is complex. On the one hand, the visual parallels between Isis Horus and Mary Jesus are striking. Many Isis cult centers in the Mediterranean became sites of Marian veneration in late antiquity and the early medieval period. The titles and traits of Isis, Queen of Heaven, Star of the Sea, Mother of God, found near equivalents in Mary's litanies. On the other hand, The Christian theological framework clearly distinguishes Mary from deity. She is exalted, but not divine. The Church Fathers explicitly denounced pagan practices, even if some symbols and traditions survived beneath new interpretations. Thus, it is more accurate to say that Isis was not replaced by Mary, but that the functions and forms associated with her migrated into the Christian symbolic world. Isis faded from temples but found renewed life in cathedrals, not as a goddess, but as a sanctified human, shaped by new theology but still carrying the emotional weight of Egypt's long reverence for sacred maternity. From Nile to cloister, the feminine in monastic devotion. Throughout the medieval period, Mary's image was especially powerful in monastic settings, where she was seen as the ideal of obedience, silence, and chastity. Monks dedicated their lives and prayers to Mary. Nuns modeled their spiritual discipline on her humility and devotion. Marian hymns such as the Salve Regina and Ave Maris Stella were sung daily. In cloistered communities, Mary was not just a figure of adoration, she was a companion, protector, and example. Her presence was felt in the architecture, chant, and daily rhythm of monastic life. It is here, in the cloister, that we find perhaps the most powerful echo of Isis. Just as the goddess once guarded temples and tombs, watched over priests and pilgrims, and represented the fusion of sorrow and strength, so too did Mary inhabit these spaces cloaked in incense and silence. She had moved from the throne of Horus to the altar of Christ, from temple cornices to cathedral niches, but her symbolic work remained unchanged. To stand at the center of devotion as a mother, a mystery, and a mirror of the sacred. Modern reverberations, Mary in today's devotional life. The sacred feminine did not end in the Middle Ages. Across the modern Christian world, Mary continues to evoke deep spiritual resonance. In Catholicism, she is the focus of Marian apparitions, Lourdes, Fatima, Guadalupe. In Orthodox Christianity, she is Theotokos, still central in icons, prayers, and liturgy. In Coptic Egypt, she remains a national and spiritual figurehead, often appearing in visions and dreams to both Christians and Muslims. What's more, contemporary theological reflection, especially feminist theology, has revisited Mary as a symbol of power and presence, not just submission. She is seen by many as the first disciple, the bridge between heaven and earth, the embodiment of the divine feminine. And for some, her image still carries whispers of a much older legacy of Isis, mother of Horus, healer of the broken, protector of the weak. What was preserved? What was transformed? In tracing Isis into the cloister, we are not seeking to erase differences, but to understand continuities. What was preserved? The image of a divine mother and child, used to express spiritual truths. The symbolic power of female sanctity, especially in nurturing and protecting roles. The emotional accessibility of maternal figures in religious devotion. What was transformed? Isis, a goddess of magic and power, became Mary, a mortal vessel of grace. Ritual offerings to Isis became rosaries, votive candles, and hymns to Mary. The Egyptian cosmology of rebirth and resurrection was replaced by a Christian theology of salvation and redemption. Yet both figures served similar purposes: to offer hope, presence, and intercession in a world that so often felt vast, unjust, and unknowable. A quiet return, Egypt's unseen influence. Today, few visitors to Marian shrines in Europe or Latin America think of Egypt. Fewer still are aware of Isis, the Nile goddess who once ruled temples from Philae to Pompeii. And yet, in the pose, the compassion, the enduring serenity of the Virgin and Child, her influence lingers. Symbols do not die. They drift, change, and settle in new soil. The sacred feminine, long cultivated on the banks of the Nile, found a new home in cloisters and cathedrals, in processions and prayers. And through the figure of Mary veiled, maternal, luminous, it continues to speak across time, offering a vision of holiness not as strength alone, but as gentleness, faithfulness, and eternal care. Final reflection: what do we carry forward? In tracing Isis to Mary, we are not unearthing a secret history, but illuminating a shared human desire to see the divine not only in power, but in tenderness. The mother figure remains, holding the child, watching over the world. Not forgotten, not erased, simply transformed. Story 5. Alchemy's Egyptian Roots, Transmutation and Theology in Medieval Europe. In a dusty monastery scriptorium in the heart of 12th century Europe, a friar labors by candlelight over a dense manuscript written in Latin, its lines littered with cryptic symbols, planetary signs, and references to arcane processes: calcination, distillation, coagulation. The friar is not dabbling in sorcery. He is pursuing a noble path, the art of transmutation, of turning base matter into gold. He is an alchemist. And while he does not know it, his craft, his tools, and even his language carry the invisible fingerprints of Egypt, a civilization whose mysticism, cosmology, and religious imagination found unexpected new life in the cloisters of Christian Europe. In this story, we explore how Egyptian spiritual philosophy, especially the writings attributed to Thoth, or Hermes Trismegistus, formed the hidden bedrock for alchemical thought in the medieval West. Far from a mere precursor to modern chemistry, alchemy was a sacred discipline, a blend of metaphysics, theology, and experimental curiosity. And its Egyptian roots carried with them a vision of the universe as a living, evolving spiritual body. The god Thoth and the dawn of sacred knowledge. To understand the influence of Egypt on medieval alchemy, we begin with Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, science, and wisdom. Often associated with the moon, Thoth was considered the inventor of hieroglyphics, medicine, astronomy, and above all, divine knowledge. In Egyptian tradition, Thoth acted as scribe of the gods, recording judgments and keeping the cosmic order. Mediator of opposites, balancing light and dark, chaos and order. Patron of initiates, those who sought esoteric knowledge. As centuries passed, Thoth's persona merged with Greek philosophical figures during Egypt's Hellenistic period, becoming known as Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. It is under this new name that Egyptian philosophical texts, written in Greek and Coptic, would come to influence early Christian mystics, Islamic scholars, and ultimately medieval alchemists. The Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablet, two key sets of texts, both attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, formed the mythic core of medieval alchemical belief. The Corpus Hermeticum, a series of philosophical dialogues, written in the early centuries CE, exploring creation, divine order, and the nature of the soul. While not explicitly alchemical, these texts taught that the universe was created through divine mind, nous. Humanity contained a spark of the divine. Through purification, one could return to unity with the divine. The Emerald Tablet, Tabula Smaragdina, a short cryptic text, widely circulated in the medieval Islamic world and later translated into Latin. It contained perhaps the most famous phrase in alchemy. That which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. This axiom, as above, so below, became a guiding principle of alchemy. It reflected Egyptian cosmology, where the material and divine realms were not separate but mirrored reflections, bound in sacred correspondence. Alchemy in Egypt and the Christian mind. Alchemy as a practice likely began in Greco-Roman Egypt, especially in the city of Alexandria. Here, Egyptian metalworking traditions, Greek philosophy, and early Christian theology intermingled. The Coptic term chem, referring to the black soil of the Nile, may be the root of the word alchemy, alchimia in Arabic. Egyptian priests worked with metals, dyes, and sacred resins, believing these substances held spiritual energies. The process of transforming lead into gold symbolized spiritual purification, not merely material gain. By the time alchemical texts reached Islamic scholars in the 8th–10th centuries, they carried both practical techniques and spiritual metaphors. Alchemy was understood not simply as a means of wealth, but as a path of inner transformation, echoing the Egyptian belief in matter infused with spirit. When these ideas entered Christian Europe, primarily through translations from Arabic to Latin, they arrived as both science and sacrament. Medieval Europe, the monastic alchemist. In the 12th century, the translation movement in Spain and Sicily brought hundreds of Arabic manuscripts into Christian Europe. Among these were alchemical texts bearing names like the Book of the Composition of Alchemy, The Secret of Secrets, the Book of Mercury. Latin Christian scholars, some of them monks or cathedral clerics, began to read, copy, and practice these ancient arts. The fusion of alchemy with Christian mysticism gave birth to a new spiritual path, one rooted in the Egyptian vision of the sacred cosmos, but baptized in Christian symbolism. A typical monastic alchemist would see lead as the symbol of sin or ignorance, gold as the symbol of divine perfection, fire as the trial of purgation, the philosopher's stone as an allegory for Christ, the ultimate transformer. Thus, every transmutation of metal became a prayer in action, a ritual of seeking divine order through physical change. Theological parallels, resurrection and transmutation. Why did alchemy flourish within a Christian worldview? Because its central metaphor, transformation, echoed the very heart of Christian theology. Christ's resurrection mirrored the revivification of dead matter. Baptism reflected the cleansing of base substance. The Eucharist, bread becoming body, resonated with the idea of substance altered in essence. Some Christian alchemists even claimed that Christ was the true alchemist, who turned human corruption into divine grace. This fusion of Egyptian sacred science and Christian salvation doctrine created a space in which transmutation was no longer heretical, it was holy. Symbolism and the Egyptian legacy. The symbolic language of alchemy was thick with Egyptian echoes. The scarab, symbol of rebirth, appears in medieval diagrams. The Ouroboros, a serpent eating its tail, survives from ancient Egyptian cycles of death and rebirth, representing the unity of all. Anubis, god of embalming, gave way to St. John the Baptist, purifier of the soul. The lotus became the lily, symbol of Mary and purity. Egyptian architecture, too, found indirect expression in Gothic cathedrals, with their emphasis on vertical ascent, symbolic geometry, and sacred proportion, a theme dear to both the alchemists and the ancient Egyptian temple builders. Even the structure of the alchemical process mirrored the steps in mystery cult initiations in ancient Egypt, from darkness and dissolution, through illumination, toward union with the divine. Closing thought: is alchemy religion in disguise? As the medieval alchemist scraped gold-colored residue from his crucible, did he think of the Nile, of Thoth, of the temples buried beneath sand? Perhaps not consciously. Yet the symbols he used, the metaphors he trusted, and the transcendence he sought, all carried echoes of a much older religious landscape, one in which matter and spirit were never separate, and transformation was the highest expression of divine love. Alchemy was not merely science. It was Egypt's silent gospel, rewritten in Latin. Unresolved thought: if the alchemist's fire seeks to perfect matter, is it not also a mirror of our desire to perfect the soul? And if so, was Egypt's ancient wisdom ever truly lost or merely transmuted into a new form? In the cool silence of a medieval monastery, the chants of morning prayer echo through stone corridors. Not far from the chapel, hidden behind thick wooden doors, lies a different kind of sanctum, a workshop. Shelves line the walls, filled with glass alembics, ceramic crucibles, bellows, vials of mercury and sulfur, strange powders and books bound in calfskin. Here, away from the public gaze, the monastic alchemist pursues an ancient calling. To an outsider, it might seem like heresy or science, or perhaps a curious blend of both. But for the man in the cowl, it is neither. His work is an act of devotion. This section explores how alchemical thought and practice took root in Christian monastic environments, guided not only by curiosity, but by the spiritual inheritance of Egyptian metaphysics, filtered through centuries of transmission. Alchemy's arrival in Christendom. By the 12th century, Christian Europe was experiencing a profound intellectual revival. Known as the 12th century Renaissance, this period saw an explosion of translations from Arabic and Greek into Latin. Among the translated texts were philosophical works by Aristotle, medical treatises by Galen, and importantly, alchemical texts whose origins stretch back to Greco-Egyptian Alexandria. Key translation hubs included Toledo in Spain, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars collaborated to render Arabic alchemical texts into Latin. Palermo in Sicily, where the Norman court embraced Arabic science. Monte Cassino, the great Benedictine monastery that preserved and studied early works on natural philosophy. Texts like the Emerald Tablet, Liber de Composition Alchemiae, and Turba Philosophorum made their way into Christian libraries. These writings, originally inspired by Hermetic, Egyptian, and Islamic traditions, were now being read under candlelight in cloisters across France, Germany, and England. The Christian reframing of alchemy. The Church had long walked a tightrope between condemning pagan superstition and embracing natural philosophy. Alchemy, rooted in both material manipulation and mystical symbolism, posed a unique challenge. But medieval Christians reframed alchemy as a moral and theological process. Alchemical symbol. Spiritual interpretation. Lead. Sin/human fallenness. Fire. Purgation/divine testing. Gold. Salvation/divine perfection. Mercury. The soul/changeability. Philosopher's stone. Christ/divine transformation. One of the earliest and most influential Christian alchemists, Albertus Magnus, a 13th century Dominican friar and teacher of Thomas Aquinas, argued that alchemy was part of the broader study of God's creation. Though he doubted its power to make real gold, he affirmed its symbolic power in guiding the soul toward spiritual perfection. Monasteries as alchemical laboratories. Though not every monastery practiced alchemy, many were ideal environments for its development. Access to texts. Monasteries maintained scriptoria where ancient works were copied and studied. Silence and solitude, essential for both prayer and concentration. Gardens and apothecaries provided herbs and minerals for experimentation. Liturgical rhythm mirrored the alchemical stages of dissolution and renewal. Some monks even viewed their ascetic life as an alchemical process. Fasting, prayer, and celibacy were forms of internal purification, mirroring the work of fire upon metals. The transmutation of the soul became a sacred parallel to the transmutation of matter. In this context, Egyptian metaphysical ideas passed through the Hermetic texts flourished. The belief that the material world mirrored the spiritual, that hidden knowledge could lead to enlightenment, and that all things tended toward perfection, found unexpected welcome in the monastic imagination. Alchemy and the Virgin Mary. Interestingly, Mary herself, already shaped by earlier Egyptian archetypes, became a symbolic presence in alchemical texts. She was seen as materia prima, the pure, receptive substance from which divine transformation could occur. Her womb was likened to the alembic, the vessel in which spiritual transmutation took place. The Annunciation was described in metaphors of sublimation and infusion, where the Holy Spirit descended as vapor to transform base humanity into divine incarnation. One 14th century alchemical poem, Aurora Consurgens, often attributed to Thomas Aquinas, though probably written by a mystic, merges Marian devotion with Hermetic symbolism. She is the vessel of brightness, the fountain of dew that moistens the earth, turning leaden sorrow to golden joy. Such language betrays not only a theological purpose, but an alchemical imagination formed by ancient ideas Egyptian, Christian, and esoteric. The role of secrecy, echoes of the Egyptian mysteries. Secrecy was a defining feature of both Egyptian temple rites and medieval alchemical writing. Egyptian initiates into the mystery schools of Isis or Thoth swore oaths of silence and encoded their teachings in symbolic form. Likewise, medieval alchemists used pseudonyms, riddles, and allegorical imagery to veil their knowledge. The secrecy served many purposes: to protect against accusations of heresy or sorcery, to honor the sacredness of hidden wisdom, to ensure that only the spiritually prepared could interpret the symbols correctly. Alchemical treatises often included elaborate drawings: lions devouring serpents, crowned kings entering furnaces, suns and moons in union. These were not puzzles for amusement, but maps of inner transformation, crafted in the same spirit as Egyptian tomb inscriptions designed to guide the soul through the afterlife. Alchemy as monastic survival strategy. While alchemy was primarily spiritual, its practical applications were not lost on monasteries. Some experimented with metal alloys, stained glass, and medicinal tinctures. Recipes for elixirs, cosmetics, and inks were preserved in cloistered labs. Knowledge of herbal distillation and mercurial compounds helped support monastery infirmaries. Even when the great work, magnum opus of making gold, remained elusive, these pursuits helped monasteries remain centers of learning, healing, and economic resilience, a theme that resonated with both Egyptian and Christian views of the interdependence of sacred and material life. The Egyptian legacy in alchemical language. The language of alchemy retained many Egyptian echoes, even as it evolved. Words like elixir, alchemy, and chem traced etymological roots to Egypt. The Nile's black earth, Kemet, symbolized fertility and transformation, a metaphor transmuted into the prima materia of alchemy. Hieroglyphic-like symbols such as the Ouroboros, the Ankh, and even pyramidal forms were adapted into mystical diagrams in alchemical texts. These were not mere aesthetic choices. They reflected a worldview inherited from the banks of the Nile, that transformation was the path to truth, that matter contained mystery, and that to know the nature of creation was to draw closer to the Creator. Unresolved thought. If cloistered monks and Hermetic philosophers alike sought divine truth through the crucible and the flame, how much of their fire still burns with the light of ancient Egypt? It is the final hour of a long night in a stony cloister tucked deep within the Alps. The alchemist priest, weary from hours beside the furnace, watches as a subtle change flickers within the glass alembic. The dull gray of the compound is shifting, rising, separating, beginning to glow with faint color. But whether this is gold forming or only illusion, he cannot say. He whispers a prayer not for riches, but for illumination. For centuries, such moments stood at the heart of an extraordinary intellectual journey, one that had begun not in medieval Europe, but on the banks of the Nile. In this final section, we explore how the ultimate goal of alchemy, the philosopher's stone, represented not only material ambition but spiritual fulfillment, and how this idea, shaped by Egyptian theology, continued to echo long after alchemy itself faded from the monasteries and apothecaries of Europe. The magnum opus, the great work. At the heart of alchemy stood the magnum opus, or great work, the transformation of base matter into perfected substance, most commonly the transmutation of lead into gold. But gold was more than a metal. It was the perfect form of matter, incorruptible and eternal, a symbol of divine perfection and harmony, an allegory for the soul's journey toward enlightenment. The stages of this work were often expressed using color metaphors. Negrito, blackening, decay, dissolution, the breaking down of impurities. Albedo, whitening, purification, clarity, the emergence of essence. Citrinitas, yellowing, awakening, illumination, understanding. Rubedo, reddening, completion, perfection, union with the divine. These stages mirrored not only psychological transformation, but also the cosmic cycles of birth, death, and rebirth central to Egyptian religion, particularly the myth of Osiris, whose dismemberment and reconstitution symbolized the death of the ego and rebirth of the soul. The Philosopher's Stone, a spiritual artifact. The Philosopher's Stone, that elusive substance at the heart of the great work, was never just about making gold. In many texts, it was said to cure all diseases, grant eternal life, perfect the soul, reveal the secrets of the universe. In the writings of later alchemists such as Paracelsus, the stone became a symbol of Christ, the ultimate healer and transmuter. But this concept may also have ancient Egyptian roots. The Benben stone, a sacred object in Heliopolitan theology, was believed to mark the spot where creation began, a point of divine emergence. It was the first land to rise from the primordial waters, the perch of the phoenix Bennu, and the place where the sun god Ra first revealed himself. The alchemical stone, likewise, was imagined as a point of origin and culmination, where all elements, all polarities, and all processes found unity. The Egyptian Benben and the Philosopher's Stone served the same symbolic purpose, the still point in the turning world, where spirit and matter reconciled. Alchemy as salvation, the soul's laboratory. For many medieval thinkers, alchemy offered a vision of redemption through process. Just as metals could be purified through fire, so too could the soul be refined through trials, knowledge, and divine aid. The furnace became a symbol of purgatory, where sins were burned away. Mercury, ever-changing, represented the soul's journey through instability toward truth. Gold, radiant and incorruptible, represented heavenly reward. This metaphysical framing aligned with Egyptian ritual practice, where the dead underwent judgment, weighing, and purification in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead describes the soul's journey through the Jewat, a realm of darkness and trial, before reaching the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal peace. Medieval alchemists echoed this cosmology in their own diagrams of spiritual ascent, often pairing planetary spheres with stages of the soul's refinement, a fusion of Christian eschatology and Egyptian cosmology, translated through Hermetic symbolism. Alchemy's fall and transformation. By the 17th century, alchemy began to decline as an accepted scientific pursuit. The rise of the scientific method, empirical experimentation, and the increasing separation between natural philosophy and theology cast suspicion on alchemical language and goals. Some developments included the emergence of chemistry as a distinct field, with figures like Robert Boyle rejecting alchemical mysticism, the persecution of alchemists as frauds or occultists, the Church's growing concern over the esoteric nature of alchemy and its links to heretical movements. Yet even as the practice of alchemy faded, its symbols, metaphors, and spiritual aspirations survived. Many found refuge in Rosicrucianism, a secretive spiritual movement blending Christianity and Hermeticism. Freemasonry, where Egyptian imagery and symbolic initiation rituals found a second life. Alchemy as literature, appearing in the works of Goethe, Yeats, Jung, and others who saw in it a map of the inner life. Carl Jung, in particular, revived alchemy as a psychological system, interpreting its symbols as expressions of the unconscious self-seeking individuation. For Jung, the philosopher's stone was not gold, but wholeness, a symbolic goal echoing both Egyptian initiation and Christian redemption. The sacred feminine and the rebirth of matter. In both Egyptian and alchemical traditions, feminine symbols played vital roles. Isis, the divine mother, who gathered the pieces of Osiris and breathed him back to life. Mary, the receptacle of divine transformation. The moon, representing flux, change, and the alchemical solve et coagula, to dissolve and to bind. The sacred feminine, far from a passive vessel, was the essential agent of transformation. In alchemical emblems, the union of sun, gold, masculine, and moon, silver, feminine, produced the philosopher's child, the perfected self. These metaphors served not only to express cosmic balance, but to encode ancient Egyptian intuitions about the soul's journey, carried forward under medieval robes and cruciform theology. Legacy and reflection, Egypt's alchemical afterlife. So where, then, do we find Egypt in the ashes of Europe's alchemical past? Not in the test tubes of chemistry, nor in the superstition of modern magic, but in something subtler. In the belief that the material world is not dead, but capable of transformation. In the conviction that knowledge is not only empirical, but spiritual. In the intuition that human nature itself is alchemical, incomplete, yet perfectible. The Egyptian belief in divine immanence, in a universe suffused with sacred correspondences, never truly disappeared. It passed into alchemy, and from alchemy into the deeper layers of modern thought, into psychology, literature, mysticism, and even quantum speculation. Final reflection: what is gold if not the light buried in matter? The medieval alchemist, laboring beside his furnace, was not simply chasing wealth. He was enacting an ancient prayer, the hope that something pure, beautiful, and eternal could emerge from the broken, the flawed, the mundane. That prayer, whispered along the Nile, echoed through cloisters and laboratories for centuries. And perhaps it still echoes now. Story 6. The Nile as Memory, Egyptian Geography in Christian Pilgrimage Maps. You unroll a parchment, its edges yellowed and curling like the petals of an old flower. The map before you is not a precise replica of the world, it is a story told in ink. A river flows vertically down the center, branching into streams that form the arms of a symbolic cross. Cities are marked with crosses or domes, their placement guided not by longitude but by faith. In the corner, the Nile coils its way southward from Eden. This is a Mappa Mundi, a medieval Christian map of the world. But beneath the scriptural geography and saintly annotations lies something older, something Egyptian. This story begins with a river, a memory, and a map. It explores how ancient Egyptian understandings of geography and cosmology, especially regarding the Nile, influenced Christian pilgrimage maps in the medieval era, transforming how Europe imagined sacred space. The sacred cartography of the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, maps were not navigational tools in the modern sense. They were theological diagrams, placing spiritual truth over empirical measurement. Visual sermons, revealing divine order and salvation history. Mnemonic devices, helping pilgrims, monks, and readers recall biblical geography. The most famous of these maps, like the 13th century Hereford Mappa Mundi, depicted the world in a TO shape. The T formed by the Mediterranean, Nile, and Don rivers. The O encircling them as the ocean, with Jerusalem at the center. East at the top, often labeled Orions, from where the Son and Christ would return. These maps were shaped by Greco-Roman traditions of geography, especially Ptolemy's work, but also by inherited Egyptian frameworks, specifically how the Nile defined the boundaries of the world, the flow of life, and the stages of spiritual ascent. The Nile as origin and divider. To Egyptians, the Nile was not just a river, it was the spinal cord of the cosmos. It ran northward, unlike most rivers, symbolizing a reversal of expectation. Its yearly flood was both a destruction and renewal, mirroring death and resurrection. It divided Upper and Lower Egypt, but also linked the living with the dead, through the flow toward the delta and into the sea, Egypt's portal to the unknown. Medieval Christians inherited this duality. They read the Nile as both geographical and mystical. In some texts, the Nile flowed from Eden, carrying with it the sacred waters of the lost paradise. In others, it marked the southern boundary of the known world, with strange peoples and monstrous races beyond. As pilgrimage maps began to appear in the 9th to 13th centuries, the Nile frequently featured not just for accuracy, but because it stood for spiritual separation and progression. Like the Jordan River, another sacred stream, the Nile became a symbolic border between the sacred and the profane, the Christian and the pagan, the earthly and the eternal. Egypt on the medieval map. Despite Egypt's association with biblical bondage, it held immense prestige in Christian thought. It was the land of the Exodus, a place of trial and divine intervention. It was the home of the Holy Family in exile. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph fled to Egypt after Herod's decree. It was the cradle of Christian monasticism, with saints like Anthony the Great and Pachomius founding desert spiritual communities. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land often visited Alexandria, the Nile Delta, and the Red Sea ports. The Nile became more than a physical place, it was a site of scriptural memory. Pilgrimage texts and maps from the 11th–14th centuries began incorporating Egyptian cities and landmarks. Cairo, often still labeled as Babylon or Fustat. The pyramids, sometimes interpreted as Joseph's granaries. The Nile cataracts, seen as echoes of the biblical plagues and divine power. In Mappa Mundi, Egypt was not a curiosity, it was a hinge between salvation history and spiritual geography. The river from paradise, echoes of the Nile in Edenic maps. The Bible describes 4 rivers flowing out of Eden: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. Gihon is said to encircle the land of Cush, often associated with Ethiopia. Over time, medieval scholars equated the Gihon with the Nile. This equation did more than conflate rivers, it collapsed geography into theology. The Nile became a memory of Eden, a lost flow of divine grace. It was imagined as flowing underground from paradise, bursting into the world in Ethiopia, and journeying into Egypt as a remnant of original harmony. In some accounts, the flood of the Nile was seen as a diluted form of the prelapsarian waters, still renewing the world, just as baptism renews the soul. In monastic writings, especially from Syriac and Coptic sources, the Nile was described as a channel of divine wisdom, and Egypt as a threshold of spiritual insight, both dangerous and revelatory. This belief subtly shaped how medieval Europeans viewed not just Egypt, but maps themselves not as routes to follow, but as spiritual landscapes to contemplate. Cosmic cartography and Egyptian echoes. Ancient Egyptian cosmology placed a strong emphasis on divine geography. The Jewet or underworld had clear geographical structure: rivers, caverns, gates. Sacred cities like Heliopolis were aligned with solar cycles and star risings. Temples reflected the Nile's flow, with processional routes mimicking the river's path from south to north. These sensibilities left subtle imprints on Christian sacred space. Pilgrimage routes from Europe to Jerusalem often mirrored the riverine logic of the Nile, a journey from chaos, Europe, to order, the Holy Land, from impurity to redemption. Monastic foundations in Egypt and the Levant often followed orientations that paralleled older Egyptian temple alignments facing east, toward spiritual rebirth. Even the layout of pilgrimage maps, with rivers dividing quadrants, retained the Egyptian idea of the river as axis mundi, the world's axis. One might say that medieval mapmakers, consciously or not, were still drawing the Nile, even when they called it Eden, Gihon, or the Jordan. Unresolved thought. If the Nile flowed from paradise, and Egypt became both a land of exile and enlightenment, what spiritual cartographies were Europeans really tracing when they mapped the Holy Land? We return to the cloister, not the silent laboratory of the alchemist this time, but the scriptorium where the scratching of quills and the rustle of parchment create the quiet rhythm of monastic memory-making. Here, a monk bends over a sheepskin page, painting a river in dark blue ink, winding it across a symbolic world. But it is not the Danube, not the Rhine. It is the Nile. This section explores the specific figures and institutions responsible for placing Egypt, and especially the Nile, into the cartographic and devotional imagination of medieval Christendom. It traces how monks, scholars, and mapmakers preserved the river not merely as a place, but as a sacred narrative, drawn again and again into the maps and minds of pilgrims. From scriptoria to scrolls, Egypt in monastic thought. Medieval European monasteries were more than spiritual retreats, they were intellectual engines, compiling, preserving, and interpreting classical and religious knowledge. Many monks were cartographers in the sense that they made maps of belief, combining textual exegesis, geography, and theology into visual representations of the world. Egypt figured prominently in these works due to several key textual sources. The Vulgate Bible, with its detailed narratives of the Exodus, Joseph's sojourn, and the Holy Family's flight into Egypt. Isidore of Seville's Etymology, an encyclopedic 7th century work that described the geography of the known world, including Egypt, with moral and scriptural interpretations. Bede's De Natura Rerum, which commented on the Nile's flood cycles,